Before the story begins, if you've ever been cheated, overlooked, or underestimated by someone who thought they held all the power, this story is for you. And if you want to see justice served, real, hard-fought justice, stay until the very end. Hit that subscribe button right now because we post stories like this every week. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The morning Victor Langley slapped the ledger down onto Naomi Cross's desk, he was smiling. That was the part she would never forget. Not the sound of it, not the way the coffee in her mug trembled from the impact. It was the smile. Slow. Satisfied. The smile of a man who had never once in his life been told no by someone he considered beneath him. "You're done," he said. Not loudly. Men like Victor rarely needed to raise their voices. "Pack your things. I want you off this property by noon." Naomi didn't move. Her hands were flat on the desk, both palms down, fingers spread wide. Something she did when she needed to keep herself from shaking. The ledger was open in front of her. Page 47. The page she'd been staring at for 6 hours the night before, cross-referencing supply invoices against payroll deposits until her eyes burned and the numbers started blurring together. "You can't fire me," she said. "You didn't hire me." The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind his eyes shifted. Something cold moved in there, quick as a fish turning in dark water. "The ranch manager handles all personnel decisions. That's been policy here for 11 years. Then I'll need to speak with the owner." Victor's jaw tightened so slightly that if she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it entirely. "Mr. Hargrove passed 2 years ago. The estate is being managed through a trust. I oversee operations. That makes you the ranch manager," Naomi said, "not the owner." The silence between them was the kind that had weight to it. Victor picked up the ledger with 2 fingers, like it was something dirty, and tucked it under his arm. "Noon," he said again, and walked out. Naomi sat very still for a long moment after the door closed. Then she reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out the notebook she kept at home, the one with the photocopied pages she'd been quietly slipping out of the office and running through the ancient copier in the bunkhouse supply room every night for the past 3 weeks. She wasn't going anywhere. She had arrived at Silver Ridge Ranch on a Tuesday in October, which was already a bad month for her. The anniversary of Daniel's death always fell in October, and grief had a way of making her reckless. Not in the way most people were reckless, not wild or careless, but stubborn in ways that made other people uncomfortable. She pushed harder when she should have been resting. She asked more questions than the situation called for. She stayed up too late, staring at things that didn't quite add up. The drive out from Tucson had taken nearly 4 hours, and she'd done it in a car that was making a sound she didn't have the money to diagnose. The suitcase in her trunk was one of those hard-shell ones from the 90s, burgundy with a broken wheel, and it had belonged to her mother. She was 41 years old, widowed, and broke in the way that wasn't dramatic. Not homeless, not starving, just quietly, exhaustedly out of options in a way that felt permanent. The fraud at Ridgeway Financial had taken 2 years to fully unravel after the FBI got involved. And by the time it was over, Naomi had lost her job, her references, her savings account, and most of her sense of trust in her own judgment. She had been the senior accountant there. She had signed off on quarterly reports. She hadn't known, genuinely hadn't known, that the numbers she was certifying had been manipulated at a level above her. But that distinction, while legally meaningful, hadn't mattered much to the people who saw her name on those documents. She'd spent 1.5 years doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses at rates that barely covered her car insurance. The Silver Ridge posting had come through a ranching industry job board she'd found at 2 a.m. during a stretch of insomnia. Ranch accountant, remote property in the Arizona high country, competitive salary, housing provided, immediate start. She'd driven out the next morning before she could talk herself out of it. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected. Not flashy. Nothing about Silver Ridge was flashy. But serious. The kind of land that had been worked hard for generations, that had its own logic and its own smell, dry grass and diesel, and something animal underneath everything. There were somewhere between 60 and 70 employees depending on the season, plus contractors, suppliers, equipment vendors. It was a legitimate operation, the kind that required real accounting, and for the first time in 2 years, Naomi felt something loosen in her chest when she looked at the numbers. Then she started actually reading them. The first thing she noticed was the payroll lag. It was subtle, a 3-day delay between when wages were posted in the system and when checks actually cleared the bank account. 3 days was within normal range for most operations. But at Silver Ridge, that 3-day gap appeared with perfect consistency, every single pay period, for 9 years. And the amounts that cleared were always, without exception, 3 cents to 7 cents less per worker than what was listed in the ledger. It was nothing. Rounding differences, probably. Except Naomi had never once in 20 years of accounting seen rounding differences that were consistently lower rather than occasionally higher or lower, and never seen them hit with that kind of mathematical precision. She flagged it in her notes and kept reading. The second thing was the supply invoices. Silver Ridge bought feed, fencing materials, veterinary supplies, and fuel from 6 different vendors. Naomi pulled the last 18 months of invoices and laid them out in order, and she noticed that 3 of the 6 vendors, Ridgecrest Feed, Palo Alto Fencing, and a fuel company called Sundown Petroleum, had all changed their billing addresses at exactly the same time, 14 months ago, and the new addresses all routed through a P.O. box in the same zip code in Flagstaff. She looked up the P.O. box. It was registered to a company called VL Property Management, LLC. VL, Victor Langley. She sat with that for a long time. She was careful with herself in those moments. She'd learned that lesson from Ridgeway. She had a tendency when she found something alarming to run at it full speed, and running full speed at things that were still half visible was how you fell into holes. So she sat, and she breathed, and she wrote everything down in the notebook she'd bought that afternoon at the gas station in town, and she did not say a word to anyone. That was the 3rd week of October. By the end of the 4th week, she had a list of 47 discrepancies. By mid-November, it was over 100. She met Elias Boone on her second day at the ranch, under circumstances that were not dramatic in any way. She'd been trying to find the outbuilding where old financial records were stored. The ranch kept physical backups going back to the early 90s, which she'd been told during her hiring call, and she'd gotten turned around on the property. It was early morning, barely light, and she'd been walking down the wrong path for about 10 minutes when she heard someone moving inside the nearest fence line. He was mending a section of barbed wire that had come loose from a post. He worked slowly and precisely, without wasted motion, and he didn't look up when she stopped. "I'm looking for the records building," she said. "Past the main barn, left at the water tank, second door on the right." His voice was low and even. He still hadn't looked up. "Thank you." She started walking. "You're the new accountant." She stopped. "Yes." "You'll want the records from before 2016, too," he said. "They're in a different cabinet, back corner, metal filing, labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence. Doesn't sound like what you're looking for, but it is." She turned around slowly. He was looking at her now. He had a lean, weathered face, the kind that was difficult to age, anywhere from 45 to 60. His eyes were pale brown and direct, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite a challenge and wasn't quite a warning, but lived somewhere in between. "Why would I want records from before 2016, she asked. He turned back to the fence wire. "In case the patterns changed when the management changed." She stood there for a moment. "When did management change?" 2016, he said. "February." She went and found the records. What? Over the next 6 weeks, she built a picture. It wasn't a clean picture, and it wasn't a fast one. It was built from scraps and fragments and late nights in her quarters with a calculator and a growing collection of photocopies. She ate dinner early in the ranch hall, went back to her room by 7, and worked until 1 or 2 in the morning. She lost 8 pounds she didn't have to lose. The circles under her eyes deepened from lavender to something closer to bruised purple. And she started keeping eye drops in her desk, because her eyes were dry from staring at columns of numbers in poor lighting. What she found, piece by piece, was this. Victor Langley had been skimming from the ranch payroll for 9 years. The amounts per worker were small enough to be invisible in any individual paycheck, but across 60-plus employees over 9 years, the cumulative theft was somewhere north of $400,000. The supply vendor scheme was more elegant. VL Property Management was a shell company that Victor had incorporated under a cousin's name. The vendors he'd set up, Ridgecrest Feed, Palo Alto Fencing, Sundown Petroleum, were real businesses, but Victor had created duplicate billing accounts for each of them. The ranch paid the real vendor directly for goods received. It also paid a phantom invoice to the shell company for the same goods, which were never delivered. The phantom invoices were small, never more than 3% of the actual invoice, and they were staggered across different expense categories so that no single line item stood out. The land was the worst part. Silver Ridge Ranch encompassed approximately 6,000 acres in the Mogollon Rim country. Naomi had pulled the property records from the county assessor's website out of habit just to have a baseline, and she'd found something that stopped her cold. 14 months ago, right around when those vendor addresses changed, 4 parcels on the ranch's western boundary had been quietly sold. The parcels totaled nearly 300 acres. The sale had been recorded properly with the county. The buyer was a real estate holding company out of Phoenix. She dug further and found that the ranch had also been carrying a mortgage on those 300 acres for almost 8 years. A mortgage that had been used to secure a line of credit that fed into the same shell company network. The property hadn't just been sold, it had been leveraged, stripped, and sold. And the owner of the ranch, whoever that was, apparently had no idea. Porfas. She found Elias Boone at the fence line again. It was becoming a habit. He seemed to spend a lot of time on the western edge of the property, and Naomi had started to notice that he showed up where things were. Quietly, unhurried, like a man who had nowhere else to be but had very specific ideas about where he should be. "I need to talk to you," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then set down his tools. "Walk with me." They walked for a while without talking, out past the water tank and along the edge of a dry wash. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Naomi had grown to appreciate that about him. He never filled silence with noise just because it was there. "The western parcels," she said finally. He stopped walking. "They were sold 14 months ago," she said. 312 acres. I need to know if the owner authorized that sale." He was quiet for a long moment. A hawk circled somewhere overhead, and the sound of the wind in the dry grass was very clear. "No," he said. "The owner didn't authorize it." Naomi felt the back of her neck go cold. "How do you know that?" Elias looked out toward the western ridge for a moment. When he turned back to her, something had shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies. Just a small, careful settling, like a door that had been leaning open, finally clicking into the frame. "Keep your notebooks somewhere he can't find them," he said. "Not your room, not the office." "Who's the owner?" she asked. He picked up his tools. "Keep going," he said. "You're close." And he walked away. That night, Naomi lay in her narrow bed in the ranch quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about Daniel. Not the way she usually thought about him. The hospital, the beeping machines, the paperwork that kept coming even after. But the early part. The part where he used to sit across the kitchen table from her when she brought work home, watching her work through columns of numbers with that quiet attention he had, that complete and uncomplicated faith in her ability to find whatever was hidden in there. "You see things other people miss," he used to say. Not as a compliment exactly, more like a fact he was noting. You can't help it. She'd been furious at herself for 2 years for not seeing what was hidden at Ridgeway. It had hollowed something out in her that she hadn't been able to name until now. Lying in the dark in a stranger's ranch quarters with a notebook full of evidence of another man's crimes. She wasn't missing it this time. She wasn't going to miss it. She rolled over, clicked on the lamp, pulled out the notebook, and went back to work. The morning Victor Langley slapped the ledger down on her desk and told her she had until noon, Naomi Cross had already been awake for 5 hours. She had already made 3 copies of every critical document. She had already driven into town the previous evening, telling no one, and mailed a sealed envelope to a lawyer in Flagstaff whose name she'd found online, with a brief letter explaining what she'd found and asking about whistleblower protections for ranch employees. She had also, very quietly, slipped a note under the door of the small, spare room at the end of the east corridor where Elias Boone lived. "He knows I know. I'm not leaving. Tell me what to do next." By the time Victor walked out of her office with the ledger under his arm, a note had been slid back under her door in return. She'd read it standing in the hallway with her back against the wall, and then she'd folded it very small and put it in her shoe. "Don't let him see what you still have. Meet me at the dry wash at 6. Naomi looked at the clock. It was 9:14 in the morning. She had 8 hours and 46 minutes to disappear everything she hadn't yet disappeared. She sat down, opened her computer, and got to work. The note was still in her shoe when she walked into the dry wash at 6 o'clock that evening. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge, and the air had gone from merely cool to genuinely cold in the way Arizona high country did. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had reached up and turned a dial. Naomi had her jacket buttoned to the throat and her notebook tucked inside her waistband under her sweater, which was uncomfortable and probably unnecessary, but made her feel better. Elias was already there. He was sitting on a flat rock near the dry creek bed, and he had a thermos, which she hadn't expected. He poured coffee into the cap without being asked, and handed it to her when she got close enough. She took it. "Victor sent me a formal termination notice this afternoon, printed on ranch letterhead. He CC'd someone named Patricia Hollis in Flagstaff." Elias looked up. "Hollis is the trust administrator." "The estate trust? For the late owner?" "For the late owner's estate, yes." He paused. "What did the notice say exactly?" Naomi pulled it from her jacket pocket. She'd folded it into thirds, neatly, the way she folded everything. She handed it to him and watched his face while he read it. His expression didn't change much. It almost never did. But she'd been around him long enough now to read the small things. The slight tightening at the corner of his left eye. The way his jaw shifted when he was working through something that bothered him more than he was going to say. "He's claiming I falsified entries," she said. "He says the discrepancies I flagged were errors I introduced into the system." "He would." Elias folded the letter back along her crease lines and handed it to her. "Did you save your access logs?" "Every login, every file opened, every edit with a timestamp." She hesitated. "Accounting software logs everything automatically. He can't alter what I accessed without it showing, but he can claim the originals were already corrupted when I arrived." "Can he prove that?" "He doesn't have to prove it. He just has to make it complicated enough that nobody wants to sort through it." She looked at the creek bed. There were smooth stones down there, pale as bone in the fading light. "That's how these things work. It's not about truth. It's about who can make the truth expensive enough that the other side gives up." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to give up." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. "I need to know who the actual owner of this property is," she said. "The trust administrator, Patricia Hollis. She might talk to me, but not if Victor gets to her first. I need to know if there's anyone else with a legal stake in this ranch who I can take this to directly." Elias poured himself coffee into the thermos itself, which meant he hadn't brought a second cup, which meant he'd brought the thermos for her. She noticed these things about him, the small practical kindnesses that he never announced. "Give me a few days," he said. "Victor's termination is effective in 48 hours. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "Stay on property until he physically removes you. Don't give him voluntary departure. Make him go through the process." "And if he does?" "He won't." He said it with a certainty she couldn't quite account for. "He needs you off the books, not off the property with a paper trail that shows he had to force you out." Naomi drank the coffee. It was black and too strong the way she actually liked it, but never said, because most people assumed women wanted it lighter. "You know a lot about how he operates. I've been watching him for a while." "How long?" Elias looked out toward the ridge. The last light was going pink and gold along the top of it, the kind of sky that would have made Daniel pull over the car just to look. "Long enough," he said. She wanted to press him. She had a whole list of questions she wanted to press him on. Who he really was, what his connection to the ranch was, why he moved through this property like a man who owned every inch of it and was furious about what had been done to it. But she'd been around him long enough to know that pushing Elias Boone faster than he intended to move got you exactly nowhere. "Don't let him see the notebooks," he said again. "Not any of them. I've got them in 3 different locations." Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Good." She handed him back the thermos cap and started walking, and she was halfway back up the wash when he spoke again. The land sale, he said. The 312 acres on the western boundary. She stopped. There was a lien on those parcels, he said, filed 6 years ago. If that lien was never properly discharged, the sale 14 months ago may have been fraudulent on its face. Not just ethically, legally. She turned around slowly. Where would I find the lien documentation? County Recorder's Office in Yavapai County. Public record. He paused. But the discharge paperwork, or the absence of it, that's what matters. Victor filed a discharge affidavit 18 months ago. I'd be very interested to know who notarized it. Naomi stood in the cooling dark and felt the familiar sensation she got when a set of numbers started resolving. Not excitement exactly, more like a kind of cold, focused clarity, the way a camera lens felt when you turned the ring and the image snapped into place. You already know who notarized it, she said. He picked up the thermos. Get some sleep, Naomi. She turned and walked back to the ranch. She did not sleep. Well, the next morning she drove to Prescott, because Prescott had a branch of the county recorder's office, and also because she told no one where she was going, not even indirectly. She signed out one of the ranch's older pickup trucks. She was still technically employed. Nobody had physically stopped her from taking a vehicle. And she was on the highway before anyone was reliably awake enough to notice. The county recorder's office opened at 8. Naomi was in the parking lot at 7:42 with a legal pad and 2 pens, and the particular focused alertness that came from sleeping 4 hours and caring very much about what you were about to find. The discharge affidavit was exactly where Elias had indicated it would be. Public record, available for copying at 15 cents a page. Naomi ran off 4 copies of everything and stood at the counter, reading, while the clerk helped someone else. The notary on the discharge affidavit was a woman named Sandra Grange, with a commission number and a stamp registered in Maricopa County. That was unusual. Not impossible, but unusual. A ranch transaction in Yavapai County, notarized by someone with a Maricopa County commission. Naomi wrote down the commission number. She also found something else. The lien itself, the one filed 6 years ago, the one the discharge affidavit claimed to resolve, had been filed on behalf of an entity called Rimrock Land Partners. Not a bank, not a mortgage company, a private holding company. She looked up Rimrock Land Partners on her phone while sitting in the truck in the parking lot. Rimrock Land Partners was incorporated in Delaware 8 years ago. The registered agent was a law firm in Scottsdale. The firm's website listed 10 attorneys, none of whose names meant anything to her. She photographed everything. She was back on the highway by 10:15. On the drive back, she went over it in her mind the way she always did. Not in a linear way, but in parallel, running multiple threads at once, which was something she'd done since childhood and which had made her an excellent accountant and a difficult person to watch movies with because she could never stop anticipating 3 steps ahead. Victor had set up shell companies to skim payroll. That was the simple part. He'd set up vendor fraud to skim supply costs. That was more sophisticated. He'd created a fraudulent lien, discharged it with a notary whose commission was registered in a different county, and used the discharged lien as the legal foundation for a land sale. That was something else entirely. That wasn't opportunistic theft. That was a years-long legal architecture built for a specific purpose. The question was what the purpose was. She thought about it for 50 miles, past juniper scrubland and the occasional water tank and long, empty stretches where the road went straight for so long, you started to feel like you were stopped and the landscape was moving around you instead. The purpose was the land. The money was real, and the payroll skimming was real. But those were maintenance crimes, almost, ways of generating operating capital. The land was the end goal. 300 acres of Mogollon Rim country, carefully leveraged, carefully sold, with legal documentation that appeared clean at first glance. And possibly, she was getting ahead of herself, she knew she was, but she let herself follow it for a moment. Possibly not just 300 acres. Possibly those were the ones that had gone through so far. Possibly there was a longer plan. She pulled off the highway and sat on the shoulder for a minute, looking at nothing. If Victor had access to the trust records, if he'd been managing the trust paperwork as well as the ranch operations, he could, theoretically, make it look like the late owner had authorized things that the late owner had never seen. And if the trust was being administered by someone like Patricia Hollis, who trusted the ranch manager to accurately report operations, those authorizations might never be questioned. Not until someone started actually reading the ledgers. Her hands were shaking slightly when she pulled back onto the highway. Not from fear, from the size of it. The full scope of what she was looking at settling over her like something cold and heavy. She needed a lawyer. She needed a real one, not just the letter she'd already sent. She needed someone who could move fast. She thought about the lawyer in Flagstaff. She thought about whether 48 hours was enough time. She drove faster. She didn't see Elias until the following morning, and when she found him, he was in a conversation she wasn't meant to overhear. She'd come around the back of the main barn looking for a specific file cabinet she'd been told held equipment maintenance records from 2014 onward. What she found instead was Victor Langley standing in the narrow corridor between the barn wall and a stack of old hay pallets, talking at Elias in a low, tight voice, while Elias stood with his arms at his sides looking at some point above Victor's left shoulder. Naomi stopped. The barn wall was between her and them. She could hear Victor clearly. "Told you months ago she was going to be a problem," Victor was saying. "I needed someone who would look at those books and see numbers. She's not looking at numbers, she's building something." Elias said nothing. "I need to know what she's told you, what she's shown you." A pause. "She keeps to herself," Elias said. "You two walk the wash together. I'm not blind." "We talked about the fence line on the northwest parcel. The wire's been giving trouble." Victor made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. "You think I don't know what you are? You think I don't watch you too?" Naomi went very still. The hay pallet smelled of dust and old summer. "What am I?" Elias said. His voice was perfectly even. "A drifter who's been here 6 years because you don't have anywhere else to go, and you're good enough with your hands that it wasn't worth the trouble of running you off." Victor's voice dropped lower, and she had to strain to hear it. "Stay away from her. She's leaving, and if I find out you've been talking to her about ranch business, you'll be leaving too." Footsteps. Victor walking away, the sound of his boots on packed dirt getting fainter. Naomi waited 30 seconds, then walked around the corner of the barn as though she'd come from a different direction entirely. Elias was standing in the same spot, looking at the wall where Victor had been standing. He heard her and turned, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, something was visible on his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger exactly. More like grief with a current of rage running through it. The kind of thing a person had been carrying so long they'd learned to keep it below the surface almost all the time, but couldn't always manage it in the immediate aftermath of something like that. Then it was gone, and he looked like himself again. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "Not here." He glanced toward the front of the barn. "Equipment shed, 40 minutes." The equipment shed was loud with the smell of motor oil and rubber, and a radio somewhere in the back was playing country music at low volume, which gave them cover for conversation in a way the open ranch didn't. Naomi spread her photocopies on a workbench. Elias looked at them without touching them, reading carefully, the way someone read things when they already understood the context and were looking for confirmation rather than orientation. "The notary," she said. "Sandra Grange. I looked up her commission number. She renewed in Maricopa County 3 years ago. Her listed employer at time of renewal was a company called GHL Holdings." Elias looked up. "GHL Holdings shares a registered agent with VL Property Management," she said. "Victor's shell company." Elias put his hands flat on the workbench. His knuckles were scarred in the way working hands got scarred, old white lines and newer pink ones, the kind of hands that had done real physical labor for decades. He stared at the papers. "He used his own notary," he said. Not a question. More like someone confirming that a thing they'd half expected was actually as bad as they'd feared. For the discharge of a lien on property worth approximately $4 million at current rim country values, yes. Naomi hesitated. "That's not negligent fraud. That's not somebody cooking books because they got greedy and sloppy. That's planned. That's been planned for a long time." Elias pushed back from the workbench. He walked to the far end of the shed and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she gave him that moment without filling it. When he turned around, his face was set in an expression she didn't have a word for. Resolved, maybe. The way a person looked when they'd been delaying a decision they'd already made. "There's a man named Harold Fitch," he said. "He's a ranch and property attorney in Flagstaff. Not the biggest firm in town, but he knows land law in this county better than anyone practicing. If you call his office tomorrow morning and say that you were referred by the Hargrove account, his secretary will put you through." Naomi stared at him. "The Hargrove account, the late owner?" "Yes." "How would I be referred by the Hargrove account?" Elias met her eyes. "Because I'm telling you to say it." The radio in the back played something with a steel guitar, low and mournful. Outside, she could hear a truck engine turning over, the everyday sounds of the ranch moving around them like water around a stone. "Who are you?" she asked. She'd asked it before, in different ways, and he'd slid past it every time, but she asked it straight now without softening it. "Not what everyone here thinks you are. Who are you, actually?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Someone who should have come back sooner," he said finally. He picked up the photocopies and stacked them neatly and handed them back to her. "Call Harold Fitch in the morning, and keep those where Victor can't find them." "You said that already." "I keep saying it because it keeps being true." He picked up a wrench from the workbench and turned toward the back of the shed, signaling that the conversation was over. Then he stopped without turning around. "You're not wrong about the scope of it. The 300 acres, those aren't the first ones he's moved. They're the first ones he's completed. There are 2 other parcels he's been setting up the same way, maybe 200 acres total. He was building towards something." Naomi felt it again, that cold focus, that sharpening. What was he building toward? Elias's back was to her. His hand was around the wrench, knuckles white. "A sale," he said quietly. "The whole ranch. He's been setting up to sell the whole thing to a development company out of Scottsdale, piece by piece, in a way that would have looked like the trust liquidating assets over time." He paused. By the time anyone noticed, there wouldn't have been anything left to recover. The silence in the equipment shed was very loud. The radio played on in the back, oblivious. "How long?" she asked. "He needed maybe another 18 months. Naomi thought about that, about what would have happened to the 60-odd workers on this property, to the land, to whatever history was buried in those early 90s records in the filing cabinet labeled miscellaneous correspondence. "I'm calling Harold Fitch in the morning," she said. Elias nodded once, still not turning around. "Tell him everything you told me. Show him everything you've copied." A pause. "He'll know what to do with it." She walked to the shed door and pushed it open, and the cold air hit her face. Behind her, the clink of the wrench on metal, the radio, the ordinary sounds of a man doing ordinary work. She called Harold Fitch at 8:03 the next morning from her car, parked on the road into town with the engine running for heat. The secretary picked up on the second ring, and when Naomi said she was calling regarding the Hargrove account, the line went quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted. And then she was transferred. Harold Fitch had a voice like old wood, dry and dense and heavy. He listened to her without interrupting, which was rarer than people knew. She talked for 22 minutes. She heard him writing. When she finished, he said, "How much of this is documented?" "All of it." "Originals or copies?" "Copies. The originals are still in the ranch filing system, but I have access logs showing every file was already in the system before I accessed it, with timestamps." "Who else knows what you found?" She hesitated. "One person on the property. A ranch hand." "Name?" Another hesitation. "Boone. Elias Boone." A pause on the other end that lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then, "How much has Elias told you?" Her hand tightened on the phone. "He told me to call you." Harold Fitch exhaled, not a sigh, more like the sound of a man setting down something he'd been carrying. "Ms. Cross, I'm going to need you to bring me everything you have. Physical copies, access logs, the notary information, all of it. Can you come to Flagstaff today?" Victor's termination notice is, ignore the termination notice. As of this phone call, you have legal counsel and your employment status is contested. Don't leave that property under your own power. I'll explain everything when you get here. He paused. "And Ms. Cross, don't discuss this with anyone on that ranch. Not anyone." She drove to Flagstaff with everything she had in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. and she watched the rearview mirror the whole way without seeing anything that shouldn't be there. Harold Fitch's office was on the third floor of a building near the courthouse, small and cluttered in a way that suggested he'd been practicing long enough not to care what it looked like. He was somewhere past 70, with white hair and reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and he read through her copies the way she'd read them, slowly, completely, without performing any reaction. When he finished, he set the stack down and looked at her over the top of his glasses. "You found all of this in 6 weeks," he said. "Most of it. Some of it came together faster once I knew where to look. Victor Langley has been operating on this ranch for 11 years. He's had 2 previous accountants. Neither of them found any of this." Naomi didn't say anything. "I want you to understand what you've walked into," Fitch said. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk. "The Hargrove estate is more complicated than the trust administrator currently understands. There are interests at stake that Patricia Hollis doesn't have full visibility into. What you've found, particularly the land documentation, it touches on something that was supposed to be resolved quietly and internally." He paused. "Except Elias has been trying to resolve it quietly for 2 years, and Victor has been one step ahead of him at every turn." Naomi went very still. "Elias has been trying to resolve it." "He's been on that ranch for 6 years, Fitch said. "Not as a ranch hand, or not only as a ranch hand." He put his glasses back on and looked at her with the calm directness of a man who charged $400 an hour and felt no urgency to get to the point before he was ready. He needed evidence that would hold up, evidence gathered by someone with legitimate accounting access, not someone whose motives Victor could attack. The room was quiet. Through the window, Flagstaff moved past in ordinary afternoon motion. Cars, pedestrians, the mundane activity of a city that had no idea. "He was waiting for the right accountant," Naomi said slowly. "He was waiting for someone Victor couldn't buy, couldn't scare off, and couldn't outmaneuver." Fitch looked at her over his glasses. "As it turned out, that took a while." Naomi sat with that for a moment. The feeling it produced in her was complicated. Something between being used and being chosen, and she wasn't entirely sure which one it was, and she suspected the honest answer was both, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that yet. "What happens now?" she asked. Harold Fitch picked up the phone on his desk. "Now," he said, "I make some calls." He dialed a number he appeared to have memorized. While it rang, he looked across the desk at Naomi with an expression that was almost, not quite, apologetic. "This is going to move fast once it starts," he said. "Are you ready for that?" She thought about Victor's smile that morning, the ledger hitting her desk, the termination notice on letterhead, the 60-some workers who had been underpaid for 9 years and didn't know it, the 300 acres of land that had been stripped out from under an estate whose owner, whatever the truth of that was, hadn't authorized a single square foot of it. "Yes," she said. The call connected and Harold Fitch said, "Elias, it's Harold. She's here. We're ready to move." She drove back to Silver Ridge in the dark, and the whole way she kept turning over what Harold Fitch had said before she left his office. "Don't react differently around him," Fitch had told her, meaning Victor. "Whatever you know now that you didn't know this morning, keep it off your face. He's been doing this a long time. He reads people." Naomi had nodded like that was simple. It wasn't simple. She'd spent the last hour in Fitch's office rearranging everything she thought she understood about the past 6 weeks, and the picture that was assembling itself in her mind was larger and stranger and more deliberate than anything she'd walked into expecting. She was good at keeping things off her face. She'd learned that young, in a household where showing too much got you nowhere. But this was different. This was knowing something that was about to detonate and having to walk around the blast site pretending you didn't smell smoke. She got back to the ranch at 9:40. The main house was lit. Victor's truck was parked out front, which was unusual for that hour. Naomi drove past without slowing down and parked the pickup in the equipment yard where she'd gotten it, and she walked to her quarters without looking toward the main house at all. She was at her desk with her boots still on when she heard the knock. It wasn't Victor's knock. Victor knocked the way he did everything, with authority, with the assumption that the door would open. This was quieter, 2 short raps, and she knew before she opened it. Elias was standing in the hallway with his jacket on and his hat in his hands. He'd cleaned up slightly, or maybe it was just that the hallway light caught him differently. He looked tired in a way she hadn't noticed before, the kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. "Harold called me," he said. "I figured." She stepped back from the door. He came in, and she closed it behind him, and they stood in her small quarters with the single lamp on and the notebook still open on the desk between them, like evidence in a case neither of them had finished building yet. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes." "I needed—" He stopped, tried again. "If Victor had any reason to think you knew what I was, he would have moved against you faster and harder than he moved against the others. The accountants before you, the one before them." He looked at her steadily. "There were 3 of them. 2 left on their own within a month. The third one, Victor convinced the trust administrator she'd been embezzling. She lost her license. She's still fighting it." Naomi sat down in her desk chair. That landed differently than she expected. Not the information itself, which she'd half suspected something like, but the weight of it. A woman who'd lost her accounting license. 3 predecessors. The architecture of what Victor had built to protect himself. "He's done this before," she said. "The accountant deflection. It's a play he has ready. It's the play he's running on you right now." Elias pulled the room's only other chair, a wooden thing with a cracked rung, away from the wall and sat down. He didn't slouch in it. He sat the way he did everything, without wasted motion. "The termination notice is step 1. Step 2 is that he's already filed a supplemental report with the trust administrator claiming he discovered anomalies in the books that appeared after you arrived." "When did he file it?" "This afternoon. Harold found out an hour ago." Naomi absorbed that. "So he moved the same day he handed me the termination notice." "He's efficient." She almost laughed, which surprised her. It came out as a short exhale. "That's one word for it." She looked at the notebook on the desk. "Okay, tell me who you are. The real version." Elias looked at the hat in his hands for a moment. It was a plain hat, dark felt, shaped by years of use. He turned it once by the brim, slowly. "Robert Hargrove was my father's older brother," he said. "My uncle. He bought this land in 1987 with money my grandfather left to both of them, but my father took cash and Robert took the deed. They were fine about it for a long time." He paused. "Robert never married, never had kids. When he got sick in 2019, he started putting things in order. The trust was supposed to hold the property intact for 2 years while his estate was probated, and then it was supposed to come to me." Naomi didn't say anything. She let him talk. "Robert died in March of 2020. The trust went active. Patricia Hollis was appointed administrator. She'd handled Robert's personal legal matters for years. She was competent. She was honest. But she didn't know ranching, and she didn't know operations, so she relied on Victor entirely." His jaw tightened fractionally. "I'd been living in Colorado. I wasn't close to Robert. We talked a few times a year, that was all. When he died, I came out for the service, and then I went back. Because the lawyers told me the probate would take time, and there was nothing for me to do until it was resolved." "But something happened," Naomi said. "I started getting the quarterly trust reports. Patricia sent them to all interested parties as a matter of routine. And I'm not an accountant, not by a long way, but I grew up around ranch operations, and some of the numbers in those reports didn't look right." He set the hat on his knee. "I went to Patricia. She assured me Victor's books had been reviewed by an outside firm. I asked for the firm's name. It was a 2-man operation out of Phoenix that had been engaged by Victor directly." A short silence. "I went to 2 lawyers after that. Both of them told me I'd need documented evidence of fraud to contest the trust management. Not suspicions, not irregularities. Evidence." "So you came here?" "I came here," he said. "February 2021. I'd done enough ranch work in my life to pass. I told Patricia I wanted to be closer to the property during the probate period. She didn't object. Victor..." He paused. "Victor knew I was Robert's nephew. He knew I stood to inherit. I expected him to be suspicious of me from the start. But he wasn't. He looked at me and saw what he expected to see. Something in his voice then, not quite bitterness, but close. A man who showed up in worn boots and didn't talk much and knew how to fix a fence. It never occurred to him that I'd spend 6 years learning every corner of this land and building a record of everything he was doing to it. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. 6 years. She thought about what 6 years of that cost a person. The patience of it, the controlled stillness, watching someone dismantle the thing that should have been yours while pretending not to care. She didn't have words for what that would do to a person, but she thought it probably explained the grief she'd seen moving underneath his surface that day by the barn. You needed the right accountant, she said, someone with legitimate access. I couldn't gather the financial evidence myself. I had no standing to access the books. Everything I could document was operational, shortchanged workers, vendor irregularities I observed but couldn't prove. It wasn't enough. He looked at her. I asked Patricia 3 times to hire an accountant with real forensic capability. The first 2 times she hired people Victor recommended. And the third time? The third time she used an industry job board and posted the position publicly. He held her gaze. I don't know if you were the answer to something. I know you were the only person in 6 weeks who didn't take those books at face value. The lamp hummed between them. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving against the exterior wall. He's going to try to destroy my credibility before we can move, she said. We've got maybe 48 hours before he gets to Patricia directly and makes enough noise that she freezes the situation pending review. Harold is filing for an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. It'll freeze all trust asset transactions. No more land sales, no vendor payments. Nothing moves without court approval. He paused. But we need you in that meeting. What meeting? Patricia has agreed to a stakeholder review. She does them quarterly. All interested parties, the trust attorney, Victor presenting operations. The next one is in 4 days. His voice was level, but she heard what was under it. Harold is requesting an emergency session. He's arguing that the financial documentation warrants immediate review before Victor has time to alter anything else. Can he get it? He's been Robert Hargrove's family attorney since 1994. Patricia trusts him. She's agreed to convene within 72 hours if Harold submits the documentation by tomorrow noon. He looked at her. Which means I need everything you have. Every copy, every access log, every invoice comparison, everything. Naomi turned to her desk, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a manila envelope, then a second one from inside a textbook she'd hollowed out, which she'd felt slightly ridiculous about at the time and now felt entirely practical about. She set them on the desk between them. That's everything through yesterday, she said. I pulled 2 more things today after I got to Fitch's office. The notary information and the Rimrock Land Partners Incorporation docs. She hesitated. There's one more thing I haven't been able to fully document. The payroll discrepancy. I can show the pattern, but I don't have the bank records to prove where the money actually went. The amounts cleared lower than they were posted, consistently, but without access to the ranch's bank statements, I can't follow the money past the ledger. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and set a folded document on the desk. She picked it up. It was a bank statement. The ranch's primary operating account, current month. And on the 3rd page, highlighted in the particular orange of a cheap highlighter that had seen better days, was a recurring transfer. Monthly. Same amount. To an account number she didn't recognize. How did you get this? She asked. Robert gave me limited signatory authority on the operating account in 2019 when he got sick. It was precautionary. If something happened before the probate was complete, someone needed to be able to keep the payroll running. He paused. Victor doesn't know that authority was never revoked. Naomi stared at the transfer amount, ran the math in her head. Multiplied by 12 months, multiplied by 9 years. Felt something tighten in her chest. That's the payroll skim, she said. That's exactly the aggregate amount. Yes. She set the statement down very carefully. Harold has to file this with the rest. This is the connective tissue. Without this, we can show a pattern. With this, we can show the destination. It goes to the same account network as VL Property Management, he said. Harold's already traced it. It'll be in the filing tomorrow. They sat for a moment in the quiet of that, the particular quiet of a thing that has been building for a long time finally finding its shape. He's going to know, Naomi said. When Harold files the injunction, Victor's going to know immediately. Yes. What does he do when he knows? Elias was quiet for a beat. He's done it before, not here. I don't mean here. Before Silver Ridge, in his previous position, when someone got close, he moved to control the narrative. He goes to whoever has authority, and he gets there first with a story. He paused. He'll go to Patricia. Tonight? Possibly. He stood, picked up his hat. Which is why Harold is calling Patricia tonight, before Victor can. Naomi stood too. She held out her hand for the envelope back, and he looked at her. Harold needs those, he said. I know. I'm making copies first. She nodded toward the ancient copier down the hall, the bunkhouse one she'd been using for weeks. 20 minutes. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, quite, but adjacent to one. The expression of a man who had been watching a person work for weeks and had arrived at a settled opinion about what they were capable of. Okay, he said. 20 minutes. She did not sleep again that night. She made copies and reorganized everything by category: payroll, vendor fraud, land documentation, bank records. And she made a second index, a master document listing every piece of evidence with a brief description and the date she'd obtained it, because she'd learned from Ridgway that the organization of evidence mattered as much as the evidence itself. If you handed a lawyer a box of papers, you got a lawyer sorting papers. If you handed a lawyer a sorted, indexed, cross-referenced package, you got a lawyer who could hit the ground running. She finished at 4 a.m, sat at her desk with cold coffee, and thought about what came next. The meeting. 72 hours, Harold had said. She tried to picture it. Patricia Hollis, Harold Fitch, Victor, herself, possibly Elias. A conference room somewhere. Papers on a table. Victor's face when he understood what was in those papers. She'd been in rooms like that before. The Ridgway aftermath had involved 3 separate conference room sessions with investigators, lawyers, compliance officers. She'd sat in those rooms knowing she was innocent and feeling guilty anyway, because that was what those rooms did to a person. The institutional weight of them pressed down on you regardless of which side you were on. She'd watched other people in those rooms. She'd watched people who were guilty perform innocence badly, and she'd watched people who were innocent perform guilt by accident because they were nervous, and she'd watched one man, the CFO who'd actually run the scheme, perform total calm in a way that had impressed her even as she'd hated him for it. Victor would be like that. She was certain of it. He'd been doing this for 11 years. He wasn't going to walk into a meeting and fall apart. He'd have a counter-narrative ready. He'd have paperwork. He'd have Patricia half convinced before they even sat down, probably, and he'd look at Naomi across that table with the same flat confidence he'd shown when he slapped the ledger on her desk. Because men like Victor didn't believe until the very last second that the thing they'd built could actually come down. She thought about the workers, the 60-some people on this ranch who'd been shorted every paycheck for 9 years, a few dollars at a time, an amount so small that none of them would have thought to question it. She thought about the woman who'd come before her, the accountant who'd lost her license. She thought about 300 acres of high country land that had been sold out from under a dead man's estate. Then she thought about Elias. 6 years of silence. 6 years of fence wire and early mornings and watching the place that should have been his get quietly carved up by a man who'd smiled to his face every day. 6 years of waiting for someone who could read the numbers. She picked up her pen and added 2 more items to the evidence index that she'd forgotten to include. Then she closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and lay down on top of her covers with her boots on. Victor found her at 7 the next morning. She was in the office, at her desk, doing exactly what she'd been doing every morning for 6 weeks. Working. She had the supply logs open, cross-referencing the Sundown Petroleum invoices with the fuel purchase records, not because she needed more evidence at this point, but because she needed something to do with her hands and her face, something to be visibly doing when he walked in. He walked in at 7:04. She heard him in the corridor first, that particular walk, unhurried and heavy, the walk of a man who assumed every room was already his before he entered it. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. "You're still here," he said. "My employment status is legally contested," she said to the supply log. "My attorney advised me to remain on property." A pause. "Your attorney?" "Harold Fitch, Flagstaff." She turned a page. "I believe you know the name." The silence that followed had a quality she'd never heard from Victor before. Not anger. She'd heard his anger, the controlled version of it. This was something that lived underneath anger, a recalculation. The sound of a man whose internal model of a situation had just shifted. "You filed," he said. "My attorney filed." She looked up then, because she needed to see his face, and because she'd decided sometime around 3 in the morning that she was done looking at anything in this room other than what was actually there. An emergency injunction on trust asset transactions, pending review of financial documentation. You'll have been served by now, or you will be within the hour. Victor stepped into the room. He didn't raise his voice. She'd known he wouldn't. He walked to the desk and stood on the other side of it and looked at her with an expression that was, she realized, the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd ever seen on his face. Behind the controlled surface of him, something had gone cold and focused and very still, like an animal deciding whether to run or stand. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "I understand exactly what I'm doing. You have copies of documents that are ranch property. You've removed proprietary financial records. I photocopied them. Originals are where they've always been." She kept her voice level. "The photocopying is legal under Arizona whistleblower statute. My attorney confirmed it." Victor put both hands on the desk, leaned in slightly. It was meant to be physically intimidating. She could see the mechanics of it, the way he'd probably done it a dozen times. And it was, a little, because she was human, and he was larger than her and angry in a way he was barely containing. But she kept her eyes on his, and she did not lean back. "I built this ranch," he said. It came out low and tight, and she understood from the sound of it that he actually believed it. That was the thing about men like Victor. They told themselves a story about what they deserved, and they believed it so fully that the theft stopped feeling like theft. "Robert Hargrove barely set foot on this property in his last 5 years. Everything this place is, everything it runs on, that's 11 years of my work. And the work of 60 people you've been underpaying since 2015, she said. His jaw clamped shut. "And the legitimate suppliers you defrauded, and the estate you've been stripping." She paused. "The work of a man who's been sleeping in a bunkhouse for 6 years waiting for someone to help him take his land back." Victor went very still. She watched it happen, the moment he understood who she was talking about. It crossed his face like weather, fast and total, and then it was gone, and what replaced it was something she had no name for, a look she associated with people who had just realized the board they'd been standing on was not the floor. He straightened up. He smoothed his jacket. The performance of composure was extraordinary, genuinely. She could see him assembling it in real time, layering it back over the thing she'd just seen, and she thought even now that Victor Langley was in some ways a remarkable person. Just a terrible one. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. The meeting is in 72 hours. He walked out. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and out through the main door, and then she sat for a moment in the silence with her hands pressed flat on the desk. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the supply log, because she had an hour before Harold needed her on a call, and she wanted every last number accounted for before she walked into that room. The 72 hours were not quiet. Victor went to Patricia Hollis, as Elias had predicted. He went to her Tuesday evening with a folder of his own documents. Naomi found out later that he'd spent all of Tuesday afternoon in the office with the door locked, and the access log she'd already handed to Harold showed 9 separate edit sessions in the accounting software between 2:30 and 6 p.m. He couldn't alter the timestamps on existing files, but he could create new ones, and he did. New summary documents, new reconciliation sheets, new narrative explanations for every discrepancy she'd flagged that presented them as her errors rather than his thefts. Harold was ready for it. He'd prepared Patricia with enough specificity. The notary information, the bank transfer records, the Rimrock Land Partners connection, that when Victor arrived with his folder, she listened to him for 40 minutes and then called Harold while Victor was still in the room. Naomi heard about the call secondhand from Harold, who described Patricia's voice as the voice of a woman who has just understood she's been managing a crime scene for 2 years and is deciding whether to be furious or mortified and is landing on both. On Wednesday, Two men from a Flagstaff property law firm arrived at the ranch unannounced and spent 4 hours in the records room with a laptop and a portable scanner. Victor watched them from across the yard and didn't approach. Naomi watched Victor watching them from her office window and cataloged his stillness, the way he stood with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in an expression that was almost peaceful. And she thought that the particular skill of a man like him was that right up until the end he looked like he still thought he might win. Elias she barely saw during those 72 hours. He was on the property. She knew that. She could track where he was by the absence of him from places she'd expected him. But he gave her wide berth in a way that she understood was deliberate. Victor was watching both of them. Anything that looked like coordination was a vulnerability. So she worked and he worked, and they existed on the same 6,000 acres without speaking, and the distance felt strange in a way she hadn't expected it to. The meeting was Thursday. Patricia Hollis's office in Flagstaff, 9 a.m. Naomi was there at 8:30. Harold was already in the conference room when she arrived, which surprised her because the building didn't open until 8, and she asked the receptionist about it. And the receptionist said Mr. Fitch had his own key, which she supposed made sense given that he'd been coming here for 30 years. Victor arrived at 8:57 with a lawyer she didn't recognize. The lawyer was young and expensive-looking, with the particular smoothness of someone who billed by the fraction of an hour and knew it. Patricia Hollis was a small woman in her mid-60s with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain. She had the bearing of someone who had been managing other people's complicated situations for decades and had arrived at a place beyond surprise, though Naomi could see from the set of her mouth that this particular situation had reached past that threshold. Elias arrived at 9 on the dot, and the room changed when he walked in. Not dramatically. He was dressed the same as always, dark jacket, plain shirt, the worn boots he wore every day. But he walked into that conference room and something in the arrangement of it shifted, the way a room's geometry shifted when the person it had been waiting for finally appeared. Patricia looked at him, and something complicated moved through her expression. Victor's lawyer glanced at Victor. Victor was already looking at Elias, and his face, for just a moment, was entirely unguarded. He'd known, Naomi realized. He'd known or suspected who Elias was. Maybe for weeks. Maybe longer. And he'd done nothing because doing something would have meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have meant the game changing before he was ready. Elias sat down across the table from Victor without looking at him. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Patricia. "Thank you for convening this," he said. "I know it wasn't the schedule." Patricia pressed her lips together. No, it wasn't. She looked at the folder in front of her, then at Naomi, then at Harold. "Shall we begin?" Harold set the indexed evidence package on the table. He'd had it bound, spiral bound, with a cover page and a table of contents, and even Naomi, who had organized the thing, felt the weight of it differently now, seeing it as an object in a formal room. Victor's lawyer immediately moved to object to the admissibility of documents obtained without formal authorization. Harold walked him through the Arizona whistleblower statute and the signatory authority documentation without raising his voice. Patricia listened to both of them with her hands flat on the table and her expression giving nothing away, which Naomi thought was either remarkable professional composure or the face of a woman who had made her decision before anyone sat down and was waiting for the formalities to conclude. It was Victor who made it real. Harold was walking through the vendor fraud documentation, the P.O. Box registration, the VL property management connection, the phantom invoices, and Victor was sitting with his arms crossed and his lawyer taking notes, and his face assembled in the neutral, skeptical expression he'd apparently decided to maintain throughout, and then Harold put the bank statement on the table, the one with the recurring transfer highlighted in orange. And Victor looked at it, and for 3 seconds, Naomi counted, his face did something she suspected he couldn't control. Not guilt, exactly. More like the particular expression of a person watching an object fall that they cannot catch, knowing they put it in motion themselves, unable to look away. Patricia saw it. Naomi saw Patricia see it. The room went very quiet. Harold said quietly, "This transfer, in the amount of $4,216 monthly, has been made to account 7741-0032 from the Silver Ridge operating account for 108 consecutive months. That account is registered to VL Property Management, LLC, Whose sole member is, I know who the member is, Patricia said. Her voice was very even. She looked at Victor. He looked back at her. Whatever had been on his face was gone now, replaced by nothing. Victor, Patricia said, is there anything you'd like to say before I ask my attorney to contact the county sheriff's office? Victor's lawyer leaned over to say something in his ear. Victor didn't turn toward him. He kept looking at Patricia. Then he looked at Elias. The look between them lasted maybe 4 seconds. It contained things that Naomi couldn't fully read. History, she thought, years of it. A complicated architecture of what one man had taken from another and what it had cost both of them. Elias looked back at him without expression. Victor looked down at the table. No, he said. I don't have anything to say. Patricia nodded, once. She picked up her phone. Naomi felt something leave the room when she dialed. Some quality of tension that had been present for so long it had started to feel like weather. She sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and looked at the indexed evidence package on the table, at the weeks of work in it, at the name on the cover page in Harold's assistant's careful printing. Silver Ridge Ranch. Financial Review. Prepared by N. Cross. Across the table, Elias looked at her. He'd been looking at the table, or at Victor, or at Patricia, and now he looked at her and his expression was one she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled neutral he maintained most of the time. Not the brief glimpses of something harder that she'd caught at unguarded moments. This was simpler. Tired and simple and real, the expression of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and was beginning carefully to set it down. She looked back at him. Outside, Patricia was talking to someone on the phone in a low, clear voice. Victor's lawyer was packing his briefcase. Harold was making notes on a yellow pad. The room was full of the business of consequence, the ordinary motion of things that had broken open finally being accounted for. None of it was clean. Naomi knew that. She'd been through enough of these situations to know that justice, when it actually arrived, looked nothing like resolution and everything like the beginning of a very long process. There were going to be investigators and depositions, and probably months before any of it was settled. The ranch workers who'd been shorted for 9 years weren't going to have that money back by the weekend. The 300 acres weren't going to reappear on a deed by morning. But something had shifted, and it had shifted in the right direction, and it had shifted because she'd stayed. She thought about Daniel. Not for long, just a breath's worth. She thought about what he would have said looking at this room, and she thought he would have said the same thing he always said. You found it. She had. The sheriff's deputy arrived at Patricia Hollis's office 40 minutes after she made the call, and in that 40 minutes, the conference room became a different kind of place. Victor's young lawyer made 2 phone calls in the hallway, speaking in the low, urgent tones of someone trying to locate a lifeline that wasn't there. Victor himself didn't make any calls. He sat at the table with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the credenza on the far wall, and he had the quality of a man who had already moved past the present moment into whatever calculation came next. Naomi watched him without being obvious about it, the way she'd been watching him for weeks, and she thought that even now, especially now, she could see why he'd lasted 11 years. He didn't panic. Whatever else he was, Victor Langley did not panic. Harold was on his phone in the corner, talking to someone at the county assessor's office about the process for contesting a fraudulent land transfer. Patricia was on her own phone, working through what sounded like a checklist, her voice low and methodical. The room was full of people doing the urgent work of a situation that had finally broken open, and in the middle of it, Elias sat quietly with his hands on the table and looked at nothing. Naomi slid her notepad across to him. She'd written one line on it. Are you okay? He looked at it for a moment, picked up her pen and wrote underneath. Ask me in 6 months. She almost smiled. She took the notepad back. When the deputy came in, Victor stood without being asked, and the deputy read him his rights in the flat professional voice of someone who had done it many times before, and Victor listened without expression and said clearly, when asked if he understood, that he did. His lawyer reappeared from the hallway and said something about arraignment procedures, and then Victor was escorted out, and the room exhaled. Patricia set her phone down. She looked at Elias across the table with an expression that mixed professional mortification with something more personal. the look of a woman who had trusted a process and a person and had been wrong about both. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have listened more carefully when you first raised concerns." Elias shook his head slightly. "You had no reason to doubt him. He was careful." "I had reason to look harder." She pressed her lips together. "I didn't look harder." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, which Naomi thought was more valuable. Patricia looked at the bound evidence package on the table. "How long will the property injunction hold?" "Until the court rules on the full fraud petition," Harold said, closing his notepad. "Given what we've submitted, I'd expect that to move relatively quickly. The land transfer reversal will take longer. The Phoenix Development Company will contest it, but the documentation is solid." He glanced at Naomi. "Unusually solid." Patricia looked at Naomi then, directly, for the first time since the meeting began. She had the evaluating gaze of someone who made judgments about people for a living, and Naomi had learned to sit still under that kind of gaze without fidgeting. "You've been here 6 weeks, Patricia said. 7 as of yesterday. And in 7 weeks you found what 3 previous accountants and an outside review firm didn't find or didn't report." A pause. "Was it that well hidden, or were the others not looking?" Naomi considered the question because it deserved a real answer. "Both," she said finally. "He was careful, but careful has a shape, and once you see the shape, you can follow it. The others, I don't know about the firm, that's worth investigating. The accountants before me, I think they may have seen pieces of it and decided it wasn't worth what finding it would cost them." She hesitated. "I didn't have that option. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Patricia looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "I see," in a tone that suggested she saw considerably more than the words contained. Thought. The drive back to Silver Ridge that afternoon was the strangest 40 minutes Naomi had experienced in months, and she'd had some strange ones. She drove the ranch pickup. Harold followed in his own car because he needed to photograph the original documents still in the filing system before anyone else got to them. Elias rode with Harold, which left Naomi alone in the truck with nothing but the road and the rim country moving past her windows. She kept waiting to feel something conclusive, relief or triumph, or the particular exhausted satisfaction of a thing finally done. What she felt instead was more like the feeling after a long illness passes. Not well exactly, but unmistakably different from sick. Like her body was remembering what normal felt like, and wasn't entirely sure it trusted the information yet. She thought about the ledger hitting her desk, Victor's smile. 7 weeks ago, and also a lifetime ago. And also somehow still happening, the way the worst moments had a tendency to keep replaying until you made them stop by force of will. She thought about the woman whose accounting license Victor had gotten revoked. She didn't know her name. Harold knew it. He'd mentioned it in passing during their first meeting, but Naomi hadn't caught it and hadn't wanted to interrupt him to ask. And now it sat in her like an unfinished sentence. Someone out there had lost her career over this, had spent months or years fighting to get it back, maybe was still fighting. That was the part that didn't end when Victor got into the deputy's car. The damage he'd done didn't get undone by an arrest. She pulled into the ranch at 4:15 and sat in the parked truck for a moment before getting out. The ranch looked the same as it always did at that hour. The slant of late light across the dry grass, the sounds of the evening shift coming on, a horse somewhere in the near corral being generally opinionated about something. 60-some people going about the work of the place. She thought about telling them and then thought that it wasn't her news to deliver. That was Elias's call. His land, his people, his 11 years of his family's history. She got out of the truck. The next 2 weeks were the worst administrative chaos Naomi had experienced since the Ridgeway aftermath, and that was saying something. The county sheriff's financial crimes unit sent 2 investigators to the ranch on the Friday after the arrest, and they spent 3 days going through the records room with the systematic thoroughness of people who were building a criminal case and wanted it airtight. Naomi worked alongside them, not as a suspect this time, but as the person who'd built the documentation they were working from. And the distinction felt enormous even when she was exhausted, and the investigators were asking her the same questions for the 3rd time in slightly different ways. Harold filed the formal fraud petition with the court on the following Monday. The Phoenix Development Company that had purchased the 300 Western acres hired a litigation firm and promptly filed a counterchallenge asserting they were good faith purchasers with no knowledge of the fraudulent transfer. Harold filed a response 14 pages long, demonstrating that the development company's principal had a documented prior relationship with VL Property Management through a shared accountant and a shared registered agent in Delaware, which the development company's lawyers apparently had not expected him to know, because their counter-challenge went quiet after that. Sandra Grange, the notary, was found at a home address in Chandler. She gave investigators a statement that took 3 hours to complete, at the end of which it emerged that she had been paid $4,000 in cash for the notarization, had been told it was a routine ranch transaction, and had not read the document she notarized. Investigators did not believe the not read part, but prosecuting a notary for fraud is complicated business, and Harold told Naomi privately that Grange would likely cooperate fully in exchange for a deferred prosecution agreement. Victor's cousin, the one whose name was on the VL Property Management LLC, was interviewed and gave the exact statement Victor had presumably prepared him to give, that he'd agreed to serve as nominal owner of the company as a favor, that he'd believed it was a legitimate property management operation, that he had never personally received any funds from it. That statement lasted approximately 3 days before investigators traced wire transfers from the VL account to a personal account in the cousin's name totaling over $40,000 across 4 years, after which the cousin hired his own lawyer and the agreement between him and Victor became, Harold noted dryly, somewhat less durable. Through all of it, Elias was on the ranch. He was doing what he'd been doing for 6 years, up before dawn, out on the property, working alongside everyone else. The difference was that now people knew who he was. Harold had recommended telling the workers directly rather than letting it spread through rumor, and Elias had done it the Wednesday after the arrest, gathering people in the main hall after the evening meal and standing up without preamble and saying who he was and what had happened and what he intended to do about it. Naomi had been in the back of the room for that. She'd watched people's faces. There was shock, and then there was something more complicated than shock. The adjustment people made when they discovered that their understanding of a situation had been built on incomplete information and had to decide whether to be relieved or annoyed about it. An older man named Cal, who'd worked the ranch for 22 years and had the bearing of someone who'd seen enough not to be surprised by much, asked Elias directly why he'd waited 6 years to reveal himself, and Elias told him the truth, that he hadn't had sufficient evidence, that evidence gathered by someone in his position wouldn't have held up, and that he'd made the decision to work alongside everyone rather than above them because it was the right way to understand what was actually happening to the place. Cal looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The payroll. Is that going to be made right?" "Yes," Elias said. "When?" "As soon as the court releases the trust assets, which Harold Fitch believes will be within 30 days. If it takes longer than that, I'll fund the shortfall personally." Cal sat back. The room processed that in silence. Then a woman named Rosa, who ran the kitchen and had the kind of authority that didn't require a title, said from the middle of the room, "Somebody should have looked at those books a long time ago." "You're right," Elias said. "I'm sorry it took this long." Rosa looked at him the way she looked at everything, with a directness that was either comforting or uncomfortable depending on whether you were telling the truth, and then she nodded once, and that appeared to be her verdict. Naomi thought about that moment for days afterward. Not Elias's speech, but Rosa's nod. The way authority worked in a place like this, where the formal hierarchy had been corrupt and what remained was the informal one. The people who'd kept things running through 11 years of being cheated, the ones whose judgment the others relied on, and what it meant for them to decide this was acceptable. On the 22nd day after the arrest, the court issued a preliminary ruling that the land transfer was invalid on its face due to the fraudulent lien discharge and ordered the 300 acres restored to the Silver Ridge property pending the full fraud determination. The Phoenix Development Company's lawyers filed an immediate appeal, which Harold noted was their right and which would not, in his opinion, ultimately succeed. That same afternoon, the first payroll correction went out. Harold had worked with the court to release a portion of the frozen trust assets specifically for the purpose of compensating workers for the documented shortfall. The amounts weren't enormous. The individual underpayments had been kept small precisely to avoid detection, but 9 years of small amounts added up. The average correction was somewhere between $800 and $1,200 per worker, with the longer tenured employees receiving more. Naomi was in the office when the corrections were processed. She'd built the calculation model herself, individual payroll records going back to the beginning of the skim, comparing posted amounts against cleared amounts, adjusted for each worker's employment period. She'd built it 3 separate times to make sure it was right, because she needed it to be right in the way she needed everything to be right, with a thoroughness that sometimes exhausted her. Cal came to the office door that afternoon. He wasn't the type for speeches. She'd observed that much about him. So she was surprised when he knocked on the open door and stood there with his hat in his hands. "The correction came through it," he said. "I know. I processed it this morning." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "You figured out what we were owed?" "Yes." "How'd you know exactly how much?" "The ledger shows what was posted. The bank records show what cleared. The difference is what was taken." She paused. "It was all there. I just had to follow it." Cal was quiet for a moment. 3 people came through here before you. First 2 left inside of a month. Third one, he stopped. "I never knew what happened to her exactly. Victor said she'd been cooking books. She hadn't. I know that now." He looked at his hat. "I didn't push back on it when he said it. I should have. Naomi didn't offer him absolution she wasn't in a position to give. You didn't have any way to know. I've been here 22 years. I should have known something was wrong." He put his hat back on. "I'm telling you because it seems like the right thing to tell you. You did what 3 other people didn't or couldn't. That matters." He turned to go. "Cal," she said. He stopped. "The woman before me. Do you know her name?" He thought for a moment. "Beaumont. Karen Beaumont, I think. Victor called her Karen." "Thank you." He left and Naomi wrote the name at the top of a blank page in her notebook. Then she went back to work. She looked up Karen Beaumont that evening, the way she looked up everything, methodically, starting broad and narrowing. It took her 40 minutes. Karen Beaumont, CPA, had filed a complaint with the Arizona State Board of Accountancy in 2019, 2 years after her license was suspended on the basis of Victor's report. The complaint was listed as under review. There was no further public record of the outcome. Naomi sat with that for a while. Then she called Harold Fitch. "Karen Beaumont," she said when he answered. "Victor's accountant before me. He got her license suspended." A pause. "I know the name. Her complaint to the board has been sitting in review since 2019. With the fraud documentation we've submitted, she should be able to reopen her case." "She should," Harold agreed. "Will you contact her?" Another pause, longer. "Naomi, that's beyond the scope of the current action." "I know it is." She kept her voice even. "Will you contact her anyway?" Harold Fitch was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to decline. Then he said, "I'll reach out to her attorney. I can't promise anything." "I know, thank you." She hung up and sat in her chair and stared at the name on the notepad. Karen Beaumont. She didn't know what it would fix. Probably nothing would fully fix what Victor had done to her career, just like nothing would fully unlose the 9 years of wages the ranch workers had been shorted, just like nothing would give back the 6 years Elias had spent waiting for something that should already have been his. Justice, when it actually arrived, was imprecise and partial, and arrived too late by definition. But Karen Beaumont deserved to know that someone had found what Victor had done, that it was documented, that it was being addressed in a court record that would exist permanently. She thought about that word, permanently, and what it meant when you'd spent years watching truth get buried under paperwork. On the 30th day, Elias knocked on her office door. He didn't do it the way Victor used to, that heavy assumption of entry. He knocked and waited, which she'd noticed about him from the beginning, the way he always gave a door the courtesy of meaning something. "Come in," she said. He came in. He was wearing the same jacket he always wore, and he looked the way he'd looked since the meeting in Patricia's office, tired and somewhat undone, as if the sustained effort of holding himself together through 6 years of waiting had, now that the waiting was over, released into something that hadn't yet resolved into rest. "Harold's update," he said. He held out a folded sheet of paper. She took it and read it. The court had released the trust assets in full, pending final fraud determination. The ranch was legally under Elias's control as sole heir and rightful owner. The criminal proceedings against Victor were on track for a preliminary hearing in 6 weeks. The appeal from the Phoenix Development Company had been stayed pending the fraud determination. She folded the paper and handed it back. "That's everything you needed." "Yes." He didn't move toward the door. He stood in the middle of the small office with his hands in his jacket pockets, and there was something about the way he was standing that she recognized. The particular posture of a person who had come to say something and was working up to saying it directly instead of sideways, which appeared to be a mode of communication that did not come naturally to him. "You're going to want to think about the operation going forward," she said, to help him along. "Management structure, accounting oversight, whatever replaces what Victor had. That's going to take some time to set up properly." "Yes." He looked at her. "I want to talk about that." "Okay." Victor controlled everything because one person controlled everything. The financial records, the vendor relationships, the payroll, the personnel. There was no separation of oversight, no checks, nothing that would catch what he was doing. He paused. "I don't know enough about financial management to build that structure myself. I know what it needs to accomplish. I don't know how to build it." "That's what accountants are for," she said. "That's what a particular kind of accountant is for." He met her eyes. "Not someone who just processes numbers. Someone who builds systems that prevent exactly what happened here. Oversight structures, audit trails, separation of duties." He paused again. "Someone who understands what corruption looks like from the inside and knows how to build something it can't get into." Naomi looked at him carefully. "You're asking me to stay. I'm asking if you want to stay." The distinction seemed important to him. "There's a difference." "There is," she agreed. She looked at the desk. Her desk, she'd started thinking of it as, which was either premature or accurate depending on how this conversation went. What would the position actually be? Not just accountant. Financial director, oversight of all accounts, payroll, vendor relationships, reporting directly to me, with independent authority to flag anything that looks wrong to whatever outside review process you think is appropriate. He paused. "I've been thinking about a community board. Cal and a few of the senior hands, someone from outside the ranch, quarterly reviews, open books." She was quiet for a moment. The window behind her desk showed the late afternoon light going golden on the grass, and somewhere outside a horse was being walked back toward the barn, its hoofbeats slow and regular. "The pay would need to be correct," she said. "Name it." "I'm not going to name it. I'm going to tell you what the market rate is for a financial director at an operation this size, and I expect you to pay it. Not more, because that creates its own problems. Not less, because I've had enough of being underpaid for work that matters." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like recognition. "Fair. And if I find something wrong, I report it. To you, to the board, to whatever external authority the situation requires. No exceptions, no courtesy delays." "I wouldn't want it any other way." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same direct, unhurried attention he'd had since the first morning at the fence line, when he'd told her about the records from before 2016 without explaining why he knew they mattered. "Why did you trust me?" she said. "From the beginning. You'd never met me. 3 people before me walked away or got destroyed. Why did you think I'd be different?" He was quiet for a moment. She'd asked him things like this before, and he'd deflected or redirected, but this time he seemed to actually consider it. "You drove 4 hours in a car that was making a bad noise," he said. "You got here, and you started reading the books the same day. You didn't talk about it. You didn't mention it to anyone, didn't seem to be building toward anything. You just read." He paused. "And you looked like someone who'd been through something that hadn't broken you. Someone who'd learned to be careful about the wrong things and careful about the right things, and knew the difference." He paused again. I didn't trust you immediately. I watched you for 2 weeks before I said anything. The records before 2016. That was 2 weeks in. She thought about the fence line, the gray morning light, him working on the wire without looking up, and then that one piece of information offered so precisely that she hadn't been able to hear it as anything but intentional. What would you have done if I hadn't followed it? She asked. Kept watching, he said. Waited for the next one. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact about what the situation required, and she thought that was the most honest thing she'd heard anyone say in a long time. She looked at the desk again. 7 weeks of bad coffee and no sleep and photocopies and the constant low-grade anxiety of knowing something that could end her if she got it wrong. The ancient copier down the hall. The notebook she still kept close even though there was nothing left to hide. I'll stay through the end of the criminal proceeding, she said. That's the period when the accounts will need the most oversight and documentation. After that, we renegotiate based on how the operation looks with proper management in place. That works, he said. And the position needs a different title. Financial director implies I'm just tracking the money. What I'd actually be doing is rebuilding the entire accountability structure of this operation. She looked at him. Chief Financial Officer, if the board agrees. He didn't hesitate. The board will agree. She nodded. He nodded. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, but the silence was the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that existed between people who'd said the important things and could afford to let the rest settle. He turned toward the door, then stopped, the way he sometimes did. The woman, he said, the accountant before you. She looked up. Karen Beaumont. Harold called her this morning. He glanced back at her. She's going to reopen the board complaint with the fraud documentation. Her attorney thinks the license should be restored. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for days without her fully realizing it. Good. She asked Harold who'd found the evidence. He paused. He told her your name. Naomi looked at the window. The last of the afternoon light was nearly gone. The sky going that specific shade of blue that happened in the high country just before full dark, deep and clear in a way that felt almost implausible. Okay, she said, because there wasn't anything else to say. He left. She heard his boots on the corridor floor, and then the outside door, and then the sounds of the ranch in the evening. Ordinary, layered, the sounds of a place still standing and still working, 60-some people at the end of another day. She pulled the notebook out of the desk drawer. She opened it to the page with Karen Beaumont's name at the top. Underneath it, she wrote the date. Then she wrote, License restoration in progress. Then she closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer and sat for a while in the quiet of the office that was now, officially, hers. Outside, Silver Ridge Ranch moved through the end of its day like it always had. Feeding, watering, the last check of the stock, the particular rhythm of a working operation that had kept going through 11 years of being stolen from and was still here, still standing. That was the thing about a place that had been built to last. It took a long time to break it, and sometimes, if you got there in time, you could stop the breaking before it finished. Naomi turned off the lamp. She picked up her jacket and her notebook and walked out into the cooling evening, and for the first time since she'd driven 4 hours in a car, making a bad noise, and arrived at a stranger's ranch with nothing but a worn suitcase and years of experience that someone had tried very hard to make her ashamed of, she did not check over her shoulder on the way to her door. The criminal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March, which turned out to be the coldest Tuesday the Rim Country had seen in 11 years, a fact that felt coincidental, and also, in the way that certain facts did, exactly right. Naomi drove herself to Flagstaff. She'd thought about carpooling with Harold or going with Elias, but in the end she'd decided she needed the drive alone. 90 minutes of road and her own thinking and the high country going past outside, still brown from winter, not yet showing any of the green that came in April. She needed to arrive having already processed whatever she was going to feel, so that she could sit in that courtroom and be professional and precise, and not give Victor Langley the satisfaction of knowing that any of it still cost her anything. She was not entirely successful at this. She spent the first 40 minutes of the drive angry in a way she couldn't fully explain. Not at Victor, not anymore. The Victor anger had burned itself down to something cleaner and colder weeks ago. This was older anger. The Ridgway anger. The 2 years of being looked at sideways because her name was on documents she hadn't known were fraudulent. The clients who'd quietly taken their business elsewhere. The professional reference she'd needed from a former colleague who'd said with genuine discomfort that he didn't think he was the right person to vouch for her right now given the circumstances. She'd spent 2 years quietly carrying the assumption of other people's doubt, and she hadn't realized until now, driving this highway, watching the juniper scrub, hands tight on the wheel, how much of it she'd absorbed, how much of it she'd started to believe. She pulled over at a rest stop outside of Williams, sat for 5 minutes, thought about Daniel and about the kitchen table and about what he used to say. You can't help it. You see things. She pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the way without stopping. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected. She'd been in federal proceedings at Ridgway that had felt enormous and institutional, all marble and authority. This was a county courthouse, functional and somewhat worn, with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches that had been refinished too many times. It smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, and it felt, in its very ordinary way, exactly like what it was, a place where people came to have things settled. Victor was already there when she arrived. He was seated at the defense table with 2 lawyers now, the young, expensive one from the meeting at Patricia's office, and an older man in a gray suit who had the bearing of someone who had handled criminal defense for a long time and had long since made his peace with the nature of the work. Victor was in a dark suit she'd never seen him in before, and he looked at the middle distance with the same composed attention he'd brought to everything, and Naomi thought, not for the first time, that whatever else he was the kind of person who showed up properly dressed. She sat in the gallery with Harold. Elias was already there, 3 seats down, and he nodded at her when she sat. He was in a jacket she hadn't seen before, gray, better fitting than his usual one, the kind of thing a man wore when he wanted to look like the person he actually was, rather than the person he'd been pretending to be for 6 years. Patricia Hollis was there too, which Naomi hadn't expected. She was seated on the other side of the gallery, upright and contained, her hands in her lap. She caught Naomi's eye briefly and gave a small nod that contained, Naomi thought, a genuine acknowledgement. Not apology exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a woman who had made errors in judgment and was sitting in a courtroom watching the consequences settle, and was not looking away from any of it. The hearing took 4 hours. Victor's lawyers entered a not guilty plea and filed motions challenging the admissibility of the bank records and the photocopied accounting documents. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Torres who wore glasses and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had prepared far beyond what the opposing counsel was ready for, walked through the objections methodically and addressed each one with the relevant statute. The judge, a man somewhere in his 60s with the face of someone who had heard most things twice already, listened to all of it without visible expression and ruled on the admissibility questions with a speed that suggested he'd made up his mind before Torres finished speaking. The bank records were admitted. The photocopied documents were admitted. The notary documentation was admitted. The shell company and corporation records were admitted. At one point, Victor's older lawyer argued that the evidence had been gathered through a conspiracy between Naomi Cross, Elias Boone, and Harold Fitch, and that this coordination had prejudiced his client's right to a fair investigation. Torres asked him to specify what law the coordination had violated. There was a pause. The judge looked at his watch. The lawyer withdrew the argument. Naomi sat through all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in the professional neutrality she'd been practicing for 20 years. She watched Victor's back. She was behind him, in the gallery, so it was his back she saw. And she noted the occasional slight shift of his posture, the moments when his lawyers leaned in to confer and he listened without turning his head, and she thought about what it must be like to be a man who had built something carefully for 11 years and was now sitting in a courtroom watching it be disassembled with equal care by people he'd underestimated. She didn't feel sorry for him. She'd examined that possibility over the past month and found nothing. What she felt when she looked at his back was more like the feeling of a finished calculation, The numbers checked and the answer confirmed, and nothing left to carry forward. At the end of the hearing, the judge set a trial date for 8 months out and denied Victor's bail reduction request, citing the scope and duration of the alleged fraud as indicators of flight risk. Victor stood when the judge spoke, as required, and his face when he turned to follow the bailiff was finally, briefly, something other than composed. Not broken, exactly, but reduced. The particular reduction of a man who has, for the first time, fully understood that the room he's in does not belong to him. He walked past the gallery on the way out. He didn't look at Naomi or at Harold. He looked at Elias. Just for a moment, the time it took to take 3 steps past the gallery railing, and Elias looked back. Neither of them said anything. The look lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then Victor was past, and the bailiff was behind him, and the door at the side of the courtroom closed. Harold breathed out quietly beside her. 8 months, he said. The trial will probably settle before it gets there. You think he'll plea? His lawyers will advise it once they see the full discovery package. The bank records alone are, he paused, searching for a precise word. Comprehensive. Naomi looked at the door where Victor had gone. What does comprehensive get him? Reduced charges if he cooperates on the shell company network and the land sale. Potentially 6 to 8 years rather than 12 to 15. Harold closed his briefcase with the particular snap of a man concluding a chapter. It's not nothing. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. Brought it. Outside the courthouse, the cold hit hard and clean, and Naomi stood on the steps and breathed it for a moment. The sky was very blue, the kind of blue that came with altitude and cold, and the particular clarity of a March day in the high country. Down the street, Flagstaff went about its business. A truck idling at the light, a woman with a stroller, the ordinary motion of a city that hadn't known or cared about the last 4 hours. Elias came out behind her and stood 2 steps down, looking at the street. They'd been in the same spaces for 3 months now, and the silences between them had changed in character. Less watchful, less full of things that couldn't be said yet. More like the silences between people who'd run out of necessary concealment and were still figuring out what the unconcealed version of themselves looked like to the other person. Cal called this morning, he said, while you were driving in. About what? The water rights on the eastern parcel. He thinks there's a notation in the old records that Victor may have failed to renew a filing, and if we don't address it before April, the county could treat it as abandoned. She looked at him. That's an accountant problem? It's a records problem. You're better at records than I am. I'm better at records than most people. She looked back at the street. I'll look at it when we get back. He came up 2 steps and stood beside her rather than below her, which changed the geometry of the conversation slightly. He was taller than her, but not by enough to be a factor, and they'd been standing approximately this close in various barns and offices and dry washes for months, without either of them having made anything of it, which was its own kind of information. You didn't look like you were enjoying yourself in there, he said. I wasn't. I was working. There's a difference? She considered that. Usually. Today, less than usual. She paused. I kept thinking about what it cost. Not just the money, the woman who lost her license, the workers who were shorted for 9 years and will spend the rest of their lives knowing it happened even after they have the money back. You spending 6 years in a bunkhouse on your own land. She looked at the sky. Even if everything goes right from here, none of that time comes back. Elias was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it doesn't. Does that bother you? That he'll get a plea deal, probably. That the thing he spent 11 years building will cost him maybe 6 to 8 years, and then he'll get out. He thought about it seriously, which she'd learned to expect from him. He didn't give careless answers to real questions. What bothers me is the workers, he said finally. What was taken from them? I can do math on what Victor took from me. 6 years, the land, whatever, and get to a number that feels settled by what happened in that room. The workers can get their back pay and still have spent 9 years believing they were getting what they were owed when they weren't. That's not just money. He stopped. That's what a person's labor means to them, what it's worth. Someone decided their labor was worth less than it was and made it stick for 9 years. Naomi looked at him. He said things like that sometimes, In the flat, direct way he said everything, and they landed with a precision that most people with better conversational training couldn't achieve. That's why the board matters, she said. Yes. And the open books policy. So there's never a period of 9 years where people are working on faith without verification. Yes. He glanced at her. You're going to want to present the structure at the next all hands. I know. I'm working on it. She pulled her jacket tighter. Harold said maybe 6 weeks before the trust formally transfers to your name. Once that happens, the board can be constituted properly. Cal's already said yes. Rosa said she'd consider it. He paused. I was thinking about asking Patricia Hollis. Naomi looked at him sharply. The trust administrator. Former trust administrator. She made mistakes, but she knows trust and estate law better than anyone else we have access to, and she knows exactly how Victor operated because she was in proximity to it for 2 years. That kind of knowledge, how things go wrong, from someone who watched it happen, that's useful on a board. Naomi thought about Patricia in the courtroom that morning, the way she hadn't looked away. It's your call. I'm asking what you think. I think she'll say yes, Naomi said. I think she's been waiting to be asked to do something to make it right, and there isn't a thing that makes it right exactly, but this is close. She paused. I think having someone on the board who knows personally what the cost of inadequate oversight looks like is exactly the kind of imperfect solution that actually works. Elias nodded once. Okay. They stood for another moment, and Harold came out of the courthouse behind them, briefcase in hand, and said he was heading back and would call them both tomorrow. And they watched him walk down the steps and get into his car, and then it was just the two of them on the courthouse steps in the cold blue March air. I'll drive back with you, Elias said, if that's all right. She'd driven herself here because she needed the solitude. She looked at him and found, to her mild surprise, that the thought of the 90-minute drive back didn't require solitude anymore. Your truck's here, she said. I rode with Harold. She looked at him for a moment. When did you arrange that? This morning. She thought about what that meant. That he'd planned to ride back with her before the hearing, which meant he'd decided the hearing would go the right way, which was either confidence or faith, or something in between. She wasn't sure it mattered which. Okay, she said, but I'm not stopping. I don't need to stop. They walked down the steps together. Spring came to Silver Ridge the way it always did in the high country, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold nights that undid the warmth of the days and mornings that felt like winter had changed its mind. But it came. By mid-April, the grass was coming in green on the lower slopes, and the horses were restless in the way horses got when the weather finally shifted for real, and the ranch was running on a schedule that Naomi had rebuilt from the ground up over the course of 8 weeks. The new system was not elegant. She would have been the first to say that. It was layered and slightly cumbersome and required more documentation than any of the workers were used to, and there had been 3 separate meetings to walk people through the new payroll verification process before it started running without complaints. Cal had said in the second meeting that it seemed like a lot of paperwork for people who just wanted to get paid correctly, and Naomi had told him he was right, and that the amount of paperwork was exactly proportional to the amount of trust that had been broken, and that as trust rebuilt over time, the process could be streamlined, but that streamlining first and building trust after was the pattern that had created the situation they were all still dealing with. Cal had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Fair enough," which she'd come to understand was his highest available form of approval. The board had its first formal meeting in the 3rd week of April. Elias, Naomi, Cal, Rosa, Patricia Hollis, and a retired range manager named Dwight Abrams, who had worked 3 ranches in the Rim Country over 40 years and knew more about Arizona land and water law than anyone Naomi had ever encountered. Dwight had been Harold's suggestion, and Harold had been right. The meeting lasted 3 hours and covered the ranch operating budget, the vendor selection process going forward, new vendors properly verified with rotating audit reviews, the payroll structure, and the water rights filing that Cal had flagged. The water rights had turned out to be a genuine near miss. Victor had indeed failed to renew a secondary filing on the eastern parcel 2 years ago, and Naomi had caught it with 11 days to spare before the county would have treated the filing as lapsed. The renewal had cost $340 and about 40 hours of Naomi's time tracing the original documentation. She'd noted this in the board minutes not as a triumph, but as a lesson. The system needed calendared legal reviews because what could be missed on purpose by someone like Victor could also be missed by accident by someone who simply hadn't known to look. Patricia had proposed the review calendar. Nobody in the room had missed the particular quality of her focus during that portion of the discussion. The focus of someone making very sure a specific type of failure did not happen again on her watch. After the meeting, Rosa brought coffee and a pan of something she called a cake, but which was more structurally similar to a very dense brownie, and people sat around the table and talked in the loose way of people who had been through something difficult together and were beginning to remember how to be ordinary with each other. Naomi sat at the end of the table and drank her coffee and listened to Cal tell Dwight a story about a water dispute in 1987 that involved a county surveyor, 3 ranchers, and a fence post that turned out to be on the wrong side of the property line by 6 inches. She didn't follow all of it, but she laughed when Cal got to the part about the surveyor, which seemed to be where the point was. Rosa sat across from her and watched everything with the same complete attention she brought to all things, and said little and missed nothing. After a while, Rosa looked at Naomi directly. "You're staying," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Naomi said. "Good." Rosa picked up her coffee. "This place needs someone who reads things all the way to the bottom." Naomi looked at her. "You knew something was wrong before I got here." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "I knew something felt wrong. I didn't have the language for it. When you work somewhere a long time, you know the feel of a place, and the feel of this place had been," she paused, "off for years, like a door that doesn't quite hang right. You open it enough times you stop noticing, but it's still wrong." She paused again. "You noticed." "I had the language for it," Naomi said. "Yes." Rosa looked at her with the directness that had apparently always been Rosa's default mode. "Where did you get the language?" It was the kind of question that could have been casual and wasn't. Naomi considered giving the short version and decided against it. "From 20 years of doing this work," she said, "and from a situation where I didn't catch something I should have caught, and it cost me a lot, and I spent 2 years making sure I would never not catch something again." Rosa nodded slowly. "You got better from a failure." "I got more careful." "Same thing sometimes." Rosa stood, picked up her plate. "The woman before you, the one whose license they took, is she going to be all right?" "I think so." Her attorney filed for reinstatement last month with the full fraud documentation. Harold says the board is moving quickly given the circumstances. Naomi paused. "I don't know her. I've never spoken to her. I don't know if all right is the word." "But she'll have her work back." "Yes." Rosa considered that for a moment. "That matters," she said, in the tone of a woman who knew exactly what it meant to have your work taken from you. Then she went to refill the coffee, and the moment closed, and the meeting gradually dispersed into the ordinary end of an afternoon. The trial date came and went without a trial. Victor's lawyers contacted the assistant DA in July and began plea negotiations. Torres called Harold, and Harold called Elias. And Elias told Naomi over the fence line on a Tuesday morning in a tone so matter-of-fact she almost missed the weight of it. 7 years, Torres had indicated, was likely. In exchange for full cooperation on the shell company network and the land sale conspiracy, which had turned out to involve 2 additional parties beyond Victor's cousin, a title company employee in Phoenix who had processed the fraudulent transfer with full knowledge, and a vice president at the development company who had known the sale was legally compromised and had proceeded on the calculation that it would never be untangled. All 3 of them were now cooperating. The cousin had already pled to a lesser charge and received a suspended sentence in exchange for his testimony. The title company employee was in negotiations. The development company vice president had retained his own counsel and was, according to Harold, experiencing what Harold called the particular solitude of a man whose employer has elected not to defend him. The 312 acres were formally returned to Silver Ridge's deed in August. Harold filed the paperwork himself and brought the stamped copy to the ranch in person, which he hadn't needed to do. He could have mailed it, but which Naomi suspected he'd done because he was 70-something years old and had been Robert Hargrove's attorney since 1994 and had waited a long time for that particular document to exist. Elias held the stamped deed for a moment in Harold's cluttered office, looking at it the way a person looked at something they'd been working toward for so long that the reality of it required adjustment. Then he set it carefully on Harold's desk and said, "Thank you, Harold." And Harold said, "Don't thank me. Thank your accountant." And Elias looked at Naomi with an expression she was getting better at reading, the kind that meant he was going to say something he meant and was going to say it simply, without architecture. "You know I would have lost this without you," he said. "You had the evidence," she said. "I organized it." "You built the case. There's a difference." "There is," she said, because she'd learned from him that the distinction mattered, and there was no reason not to agree when something was true. "You're welcome." Harold watched this exchange with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things and had learned when to say nothing. The fall came on slowly and then all at once, the way the seasons did in the high country. By September, the grass on the upper slopes had gone gold, and the mornings were cold enough that the horses' breath showed white in the air, and the ranch was running on the new schedule with enough regularity that Naomi could identify the problem spots: a vendor who consistently submitted invoices late, a supply category where the estimates were chronically optimistic, and addressed them without crisis. She was getting better at knowing the feel of the place. One morning in late September, she was in the office before 6. She was always in the office before 6, that hadn't changed, going through the quarterly numbers for the board report. The numbers were good. Not remarkable, not record-breaking, but honest. And there was something about honest numbers that had their own particular quality when you'd spent months looking at fraudulent ones. They felt like themselves. They didn't have the slight wrongness of manipulated data, the sense of looking at a photograph that had been edited just enough to make a real landscape look slightly uncanny. She heard the knock and said, "Come in," without looking up. Elias came in and set a coffee on the corner of her desk. He'd been doing this for 2 months now, ever since she'd mentioned in passing that she was always out of coffee by the time the main hall started serving, and he'd started bringing her a cup on his way out to the property without ever making an announcement about it or suggesting it was a pattern. It was just a thing that happened. She looked up. He was standing in front of the desk with his hands in his jacket pockets, which was his posture when he had something to say that he'd been thinking about for a while. "The board wants to amend the partnership structure," he said. She waited. "The current arrangement has you as CFO, reporting to me as owner." He paused. "The board has recommended, and I agree, that the structure should be changed. Co-ownership, equal stake, financial and operational decisions made jointly, with board oversight on major transactions." Naomi set down her pen. "That's not a small thing," she said carefully. "No." "You've known me for less than a year. I've watched you work for less than a year," he said. "That's different, longer." He met her eyes. "I know what you're worth, not in a general sense. I mean specifically to this operation, to what this ranch is capable of being. I know what it would have cost to lose you in October when Victor handed you that termination notice, and I know what it would cost now." He paused. "I don't think property should be offered as compensation. That's not what this is. The board's recommendation came from operational logic. A ranch this size, with the accountability structure we've built, needs 2 decision-makers at ownership level, not 1, and the second one should be the person who understands the financial architecture better than anyone." Naomi looked at the desk, at the quarterly numbers she'd been working through, at the coffee he'd put in the corner without comment. "The board voted on this formally?" "Unanimously. Cal voted first." A slight pause. "Rosa voted and then said she'd been waiting for someone to have the sense to suggest it." Naomi almost smiled at that. "Of course she did." She looked at the window. The first light was coming up over the eastern ridge, the same light she'd watched come up every morning for nearly a year now, and she knew the specific way it moved across the dry grass and what it would look like in an hour and what that meant about the day's weather. She knew the water rights filing schedule and which vendors needed watching and which ranch hands were most likely to spot an equipment problem before it became expensive. She knew the feel of the place. She thought about what it meant to be offered something real, Not charity, not a consolation, not a reduced version of what she'd asked for. Something actual. She thought about Daniel, not with the ache she usually carried, but with something cleaner. The thought of him as the person who would have understood this moment most clearly, who would have looked at this offer and at this place and at the person making the offer and said exactly what he always said. You know what this is? She did. I'll have Harold draw up the documents, she said. Something in Elias's face settled. Not relief, exactly. He'd been confident, she could see that, in the way he was confident about most things he'd thought through fully, but confirmation. The particular settling of a person who had put something important into the world and found it received the way it deserved to be. One condition, she said. Name it. The board reviews the partnership structure annually, not because I expect problems, because annual review is how you build something that lasts. He looked at her for a moment. That's not a condition, he said. That's policy. Then we agree. We agree. Karen Beaumont got her license back in October. Harold called Naomi on a Thursday morning to tell her, and Naomi sat at her desk for a moment after the call with the phone in her hand, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. The Arizona State Board of Accountancy had reviewed the fraud documentation and issued a formal finding that the original suspension had been based on fabricated evidence, which was the most bureaucratic possible way to say that a woman's career had been taken from her by a man who'd made her look guilty so nobody would look at him. They'd restored her credentials in full. They'd issued a letter of apology, which Harold said was almost unprecedented, and which he'd pushed for specifically because he wanted it in her permanent record that the suspension had been wrongful. Naomi thought about writing to her. She thought about it for 3 days, drafting versions in her head that were too formal, too casual, too much. In the end, she called Harold and asked for Karen Beaumont's contact information, and Harold gave her a phone number, and she sat with it for another 2 days before calling it. Karen Beaumont picked up on the third ring. She had a voice that was cautious in the way voices got after years of things not going right, but underneath it was something clear and direct that Naomi recognized. I don't know what to say to you, Karen said after Naomi introduced herself and explained the call. A pause. I've been trying to figure out since Harold called what I'd say if I ever talked to the person who found it. You don't have to say anything, Naomi said. I know. Another pause. I saw the numbers too. When I was there, I saw them and I flagged them, and Victor told me I was misreading the system, and I second-guessed myself. I thought I'd made an error somewhere. Her voice was steady, but it cost something to keep it that way. I left thinking I'd missed something, that I wasn't as good as I thought I was. Naomi was quiet for a moment. He built it to look like a misread, she said. That's the point. It was sophisticated enough that questioning it was designed to feel like your error, not his construction. I know that now. It's different from knowing it then. Yes. A long pause. How did you not second-guess yourself? It was the most honest question Naomi had been asked in months. She thought about it seriously before she answered. I had less to lose, she said finally. I'd already been through the thing where the doubt wins. I'd already lived on the other side of it for 2 years. I think when you've been through that and you're still standing, you stop giving the doubt as much authority. Not because you're sure of everything, because you know what it costs to be wrong about your own certainty. She paused. I was terrified the whole time. I just kept going anyway. Karen was quiet on the other end. Then, roughly, thank you for looking all the way to the bottom. Rosa said that, Naomi said. Who's Rosa? The woman who runs the kitchen here. She's on the board now. Naomi paused. She said this place needed someone who read things all the way to the bottom. I think that's what you do too. You just didn't have enough runway. Karen made a sound that was probably a laugh and was also probably the beginning of something else that she handled by clearing her throat. I'm setting up independent practice, she said. Small business accounting. I'm going to specialize in exactly this kind of audit work. Fraud detection. Good, Naomi said. There's not enough of it. No. A pause. If you ever need a referral, if someone asks you for a recommendation for that kind of work, I'll send them to you. They talked for another few minutes about practical things, professional organizations, certification updates, the particular landscape of fraud detection work in the Southwest. And when Naomi hung up, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. Outside, the October light was doing what October light did in the high country, going low and golden and very clear, the kind of light that made everything it touched look more definitively itself. The grass, the fence line, the horses in the near pasture being horses in the particular unhurried way of horses with nowhere to be. Naomi looked at the framed document on the wall opposite her desk. Harold had suggested framing it. She'd thought it was slightly excessive, and then decided that slightly excessive was occasionally warranted. It was the amended deed of partnership, Silver Ridge Ranch, listing both names. It had been up there for 3 weeks, and she was still occasionally surprised by it when she looked up from the numbers. She looked back at her work. There was an evening in November, one of the last warm ones before the cold really settled, when most of the ranch gathered outside after supper. It wasn't a planned thing. Someone had built a fire in the yard pit, and people had drifted toward it the way people drifted toward fire, in the unhurried social way of people who had nowhere else to be, and no particular reason to be anywhere but here. Naomi was there, and Elias was there, and Cal was there with his hat pushed back on his head, telling a story that kept getting interrupted, and Rosa was there with a blanket across her knees, saying very little and watching everything. A group of the younger hands were arguing about something at the far edge of the light. Someone had a guitar and wasn't playing it yet, but was thinking about it. Naomi was sitting on a section of log that served as informal seating, and Elias was standing nearby, close enough to talk without raising their voices, and they were doing exactly that. Talking, not about anything consequential, about the water table readings from the eastern parcel and whether the spring would be wet or dry based on the current indicators, which was a conversation that could take 20 minutes if you let it, and neither of them seemed inclined to stop it. At some point she noticed that they'd shifted, in the way people shifted without planning to, so that they were sitting next to each other on the log rather than talking across a space. And she noticed it the way you noticed a thing that had already been true for a while by the time you saw it. Elias said something about the eastern fence line, and she said something back about the survey marks, and somewhere in the middle of the exchange, her shoulder was against his arm, and his arm wasn't moving away, and neither was hers, and the fire was doing what fires did, and around them the ranch was doing what it did in the evening, and nobody was paying any particular attention to two people sitting close together on a log, having a conversation that was about water tables, and also, underneath that, about what it meant to have arrived at a place you hadn't been looking for, and found it worth staying in. She didn't overthink it. She'd spent enough of her life overthinking things that turned out to be simple. The guitar started somewhere in the dark. Cal stopped his story long enough to listen, then picked it back up. Rosa looked at the fire. The younger hands settled their argument, or didn't, and either way fell quiet. The high country does something at night in November. The cold comes in clear and complete, and the stars come up with a density that feels personal, like they're directed at whoever is standing underneath them. Naomi had grown up in Phoenix, where you couldn't see much sky, and she still wasn't entirely used to what the sky did out here, the sheer volume of it. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, the burgundy suitcase with the broken wheel, the car making a sound she couldn't afford to diagnose, 4 hours of highway, and the particular recklessness of having nowhere else to go. She thought about what she'd been carrying then, not just the suitcase, but the 2 years of accumulated doubt, the weight of someone else's fraud landing on her name, the slow erosion of confidence that happened when you spent long enough surrounded by people who looked at you sideways. She thought about what she was carrying now, numbers mostly, quarterly reports and board minutes and water rights filings, and the ongoing documentation of a place that had decided to be honest about itself. The weight was different, not lighter exactly, more like the difference between carrying something that was pulling you down and carrying something that was worth carrying. At some point, Elias said quietly, "You're thinking about something." "I'm always thinking about something." "Occupational." "Probably." She looked at the fire. "I was thinking about the day I got here." He was quiet for a moment. "What were you thinking about it?" "That I almost didn't come," she said. "I found the listing at 2 a.m, and I almost closed the laptop and went to sleep instead. I'd been doing that with job postings for months, looking and not applying, because applying meant being told no again. and I was running out of the kind of energy it takes to keep going after being told no. She paused. I applied that night because I was too tired to talk myself out of it. Elias looked at the fire. I'm glad you were too tired. So am I. She looked at the sky. I think about the people who quit, not the ones before me here, Shamise. I mean, in general. The people who had the same instinct I had, who saw the wrong thing in the numbers, and who talked themselves out of it, or got talked out of it, or ran out of runway before they could do anything with what they'd seen. She paused. There are so many of them. People who were right and never got to be right out loud. Karen Beaumont, he said. Karen Beaumont. And others I'll never know about. She looked at the fire. I don't know what to do with that except keep doing the work. That's probably what there is to do with it, he said. Yeah. She paused. Yeah, it probably is. The guitar kept playing, slow and easy, something without a name that suited the evening perfectly for not having one. The fire settled. Around them, Silver Ridge Ranch continued its long, imperfect, ongoing life. The horses, the fence lines, the 6,000 acres of high country that had been in one family's hands for 37 years and were still there, still standing, because a woman had arrived with a broken suitcase and read the books all the way to the bottom and refused, when someone told her she was done, to believe it. It wasn't a clean ending. It wasn't the kind of ending where everything was repaired and everyone was healed, and the bad thing was so thoroughly resolved it left no marks. Victor Langley was going to prison, but the 9 years were still gone. Karen Beaumont had her license back, but the years of fighting for it were still spent. Elias had his land, but the 6 years of waiting for it were still part of him in ways that would take longer than a season to work through. What there was instead was this: a working ranch running honestly, under the oversight of people who had decided that honesty was worth the structural effort it required. A woman who had arrived with almost nothing and had used the only thing she'd never lost, the ability to read what was actually there, to build something that would outlast the months it had taken to build it. A man who had spent 6 years being exactly who he was without announcing it, and who had turned out to be exactly what the situation required. Naomi Cross had arrived at Silver Ridge Ranch with a broken suitcase and years of experience someone had tried very hard to make her doubt. She was leaving, eventually. Everyone left eventually. But she wasn't leaving yet. And when she did, the thing she was going to leave behind was a system, a set of structures and processes and documented procedures and a board of directors and a calendar of legal reviews that would outlast her presence, that would keep doing the work she'd done the first time by hand. That was the actual ending. Not a single moment of justice, but a set of systems that made justice ordinary and ongoing and structural rather than accidental and heroic. She thought about telling Elias this and decided he probably already knew it. The fire burned lower, the guitar played on. The stars above the rim country were extraordinary and impersonal and vast. And underneath them, a small human gathering talked and laughed and sat in the particular comfort of people who have been through something hard together and have come out the other side still standing, which was its own kind of remarkable. Naomi looked at all of it and did not look away.